Brad, Grant King of Origin said that power prices in the next 4 years, not counting a carbon tax, were likely to double. Was he right?
Oh, exactly what the price will be is always subject to various assumptions. I think Grant's in a broadly correct space. What we're seeing at the moment is unprecedented levels of expenditure in the distribution and transmission networks. Essentially, our networks are approaching 50 years of age and we're having to replace them all. That's coming at a pretty big cost. And in fact, in our own capital survey this year, we found that the new capital spend on networks has far outstripped what's expected in generation over the next 5 years. So we're seeing strong cost drivers coming through on the network side, and that's a big part of the story. It's a big part of the current increases in prices. There are then another series of elements of price drivers going on as well, and I think they're often misunderstood. Regarded as at the margin, not really significant, but they're starting to play quite a role. One of them's the renewable energy target. That undoubtedly is going to drive power prices higher because the renewables are more expensive than the traditional forms of generation that we've been used to. I also have to observe that the various state governments have various solar feed-in tariffs and other various mechanisms that aren't consistent between them, but which are all aimed at trying to lower emissions, but they come with quite hefty price tags. So when we see all of those things, I think the notion of electricity prices doubling over the next 4 to 5 years, some people would disagree with, but I think we're in for very large increases. There's certainly
are some states going to see bigger price rises than others?
Well, I think that's likely, and I think it's likely largely because of historical mistakes, perhaps, or decisions that state governments have taken in the past. We've got a number of states that decided, for political purposes, that controlling retail prices for residential consumers at below cost of supply was actually a good political tactic. The trouble with those sorts of things is that they catch up with them in the long run. We've seen, particularly in New South Wales and Western Australia, what happens when you compress prices and keep them down below what it costs to actually supply. So we've seen in Western Australia, for example, 50% increase in the last 18 months. We've seen in New South Wales a series of double-digit price increases. We also see in New South Wales the most generous solar feed-in tariff of any state in the country, and that's going to drive through into the price as well. So I think states that are still trying to catch up to what the real cost of supply is are actually going to see still higher price increases than elsewhere.
So you're saying that New South Wales and Western Australia will have some of the biggest price rises?
That's what I would expect, yes.
What about Queensland, Victoria and South Australia?
Well, they'll still experience fairly substantial price rises. Of course, Victoria is the standout state in that it's had by far the most successful pro-competition program at all levels through its electricity industry, dating back to the Kennett government, and then continued on with both Premiers Bracks and Brumby. And prices here are no longer controlled by the state. That's brought us to a new place. We've got a place where the market's actually determining the price, and as a result I think we're getting highly competitive outcomes with around 13 different retailers competing really hard for business. Now, the upshot of that is I think that you're going to see the price increases in Victoria held to only that's necessary to really meet all of the drivers. I think we're also seeing from the latest round of regulatory resets in Victoria that the privately owned distribution companies here are probably doing a pretty good job, and we're seeing lower price increases in distribution in Victoria. So I think Victoria is probably not as at risk of the large price increases, but they will go up nonetheless. There are still big capital spends going on in distribution. I think South Australia will be interesting to watch what happens. It doesn't have the benefit of large-scale, low-cost coal. It has very large wind investments going on in that state. It's always had a slightly higher cost of electricity anyway. That's probably going to continue. Queensland's probably a reasonably good news story in comparison to other states. It's got highly competitive coal. It has a slight excess of supply capacity up there. It's a competitive market. But nonetheless, again, like everywhere else, it's got big expenditures going through in distribution networks. So I actually think that the states that will see the largest increases most likely are New South Wales and Western Australia as they try to get back up to the cost of supply. The other states will still see increases, but do at least have the advantage that they're closer to the mark.